I stared at the wedding invitation in my trembling hands, the elegant script blurring through tears I refused to shed. My daughter Sarah's name gleamed in gold foil beneath the heading that read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Sarah Michelle Thompson and David Allen Carter." The date was circled in my calendar for 6 months, yet somehow I'd convinced myself this day would never actually arrive. 24 years I'd been her mother, through scraped knees and broken hearts, graduation photos and college applications. Now she was getting married, and according to her phone call last week, I wasn't welcome. "Your absence is the only gift we want," she'd said, her voice ice-cold through the receiver. Those 8 words had shattered something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired, leaving me clutching this invitation like evidence of a love that once existed. Something had gone terribly wrong between us, and I was running out of time to fix it before losing her forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across my kitchen table as I spread out the contents of the envelope Sarah had sent 3 weeks earlier. Along with the invitation, there was a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of her favorite vanilla perfume. Her words were carefully crafted, polite, yet devastating. "Mom, I felt obligated to send this invitation, but I want to be clear that David and I prefer you don't attend. We've discussed this extensively, and we believe your presence would cause unnecessary drama on what should be the happiest day of our lives." The letter was signed simply, Sarah, not Love Sarah, or even your daughter. Just Sarah, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who'd raised her single-handedly after her father walked out when she was 7. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, my hands shaking with a mixture of grief and confusion. Before we begin, hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever seen family tension at a wedding or big event? And let me know where you're watching from, your city and state. We post powerful family stories every week, and today's one will stay with you. I picked up my mother's antique music box from the kitchen counter, its painted roses faded but still beautiful after 40 years. This small treasure had belonged to my grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women in our family. I'd always planned to give it to Sarah on her wedding day, continuing the tradition my mother had started when she presented it to me at my own wedding ceremony in 1998. The melody that played when you opened the lid was "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song my grandmother had danced to with my grandfather at their golden anniversary celebration. Sarah used to wind it up as a little girl, twirling around our living room in her princess dress while the tinkling notes filled our small apartment. Now I wondered if she'd even want this family heirloom, considering how completely she seemed to have written me out of her life. The music box represented everything we'd once shared, but perhaps those memories meant nothing to her anymore. 3 months ago, everything changed during what should have been a simple dinner at Romano's, our favorite Italian restaurant. Sarah had invited me to meet David's parents for the first time, and I'd spent hours getting ready, choosing my best navy dress and the pearl necklace Sarah had given me for Christmas. The Carters arrived precisely at 7, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of old-money confidence that comes from generations of privilege. Margaret Carter wore a Chanel suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, while Richard Carter's handshake was firm but dismissive. Within minutes, I realized they'd already formed their opinions about me based on Sarah's description of our modest background. When Margaret asked about my career, the word dripped with barely concealed condescension. I explained that I worked as a nursing assistant at Mercy General Hospital, proud of my 15 years helping patients in their most vulnerable moments. The silence that followed was deafening, and I watched Sarah's face flush with what I initially thought was embarrassment on my behalf. But I was wrong about Sarah's embarrassment. As the evening progressed, I realized she wasn't ashamed of them judging me. She was ashamed of me, period. When Margaret Carter mentioned their family's summer home in Martha's Vineyard, Sarah jumped in with stories about her college friends' parents and their vacation properties, carefully steering the conversation away from our own humble camping trips to state parks. She laughed too loudly at Richard's dry jokes about working-class values and nodded enthusiastically when Margaret suggested that Sarah's refined tastes clearly came from David's influence. I sat there watching my daughter transform into someone I barely recognized, someone who seemed desperate to distance herself from everything we'd shared together. The woman across from me bore little resemblance to the girl who used to help me plant tomatoes in our tiny backyard garden every spring. When I mentioned how proud I was of Sarah's journalism degree, Margaret waved dismissively and said, "Oh, but she'll be far too busy with charity work and entertaining once she's properly established." Sarah didn't contradict her. The turning point came when Richard Carter asked about Sarah's father, clearly fishing for information about our family background. I explained honestly that Tom had left when Sarah was 7, that we'd built our life together, just the two of us, and that I was proud of how strong and independent she'd become. Margaret's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly as she murmured something about broken homes and their effects on children's development. Sarah's face went scarlet, and she quickly changed the subject to wedding planning details. For the remainder of the dinner, she treated me like an embarrassing relative they'd reluctantly invited out of obligation. When the check arrived, Richard insisted on paying, making a show of his Platinum American Express card while commenting that he was happy to help with expenses. The message was clear. I couldn't afford to contribute meaningfully to my own daughter's wedding. Sarah didn't defend me or clarify that I'd already saved $3,000 specifically for wedding costs. Instead, she thanked him profusely and promised they'd discuss the guest list soon. That guest list conversation happened 2 weeks later in my living room, surrounded by the same family photos and handmade quilts that had been our backdrop for countless heart-to-hearts over the years. Sarah perched on the edge of my worn sofa like she couldn't wait to leave, her designer handbag clutched in her manicured hands. She explained that the Carter family had very specific expectations about the wedding, that their social circle required a certain level of sophistication, and that some of my relatives might not fit in with their vision. I listened in stunned silence as she systematically eliminated people from the invitation list. My sister Janet because she worked at a diner, my cousin Mike because he didn't own a suit, my co-workers from the hospital because they weren't professional enough. See, when I asked about my own role in the wedding, Sarah hesitated for a long moment before suggesting that perhaps I could attend the ceremony but skip the reception. The reception, she explained, would be filled with David's family's business associates and social contacts who wouldn't understand our background. I felt like she was speaking a foreign language, using words like appropriate and expectations to justify cutting me out of what should have been our shared celebration. The final blow came when Sarah stood to leave, smoothing down her expensive skirt and checking her reflection in my hallway mirror. "Mom, you have to understand that David and I are starting a new life together. His family has certain standards, and I can't have anything jeopardizing his career prospects or our social standing. You've done your job raising me, but now it's time for me to move forward with people who can help us succeed." She delivered these words matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than dismantling our entire relationship. I asked her if she remembered the nights I worked double shifts to pay for her college textbooks, the times I went without new clothes so she could have everything she needed for school trips and activities. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but then she shook her head and said, "That's exactly what I mean, Mom. You always make everything about sacrifice and struggle. David's family doesn't think that way. They focus on success and moving upward, not dwelling on the past." She kissed my cheek perfunctorily and left, her heels clicking across my wooden porch steps like a countdown timer marking the end of everything we'd once been to each other. The music box sat silent on my kitchen table as I replayed that devastating conversation for the 100th time, wondering where I'd gone wrong as a mother. Had I been too protective, too focused on our modest means, too proud of the simple life we'd built together? Sarah was right that I'd worked multiple jobs to support us, that I'd stressed about money and made sacrifices to give her opportunities I'd never had. But I'd thought those struggles had brought us closer, had taught her the value of hard work and determination. Apparently, I'd been teaching her to be ashamed instead. Margaret Carter's words echoed in my mind. Broken homes and their effects on children's development. Maybe she was right. Maybe Sarah's rejection of me was simply the inevitable result of raising her without a father, without the financial security and social connections that David's family took for granted. I opened the music box and listened to the familiar melody, remembering all the times Sarah and I had danced to this song in our tiny living room, laughing until our sides hurt. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Janet. Any word from Sarah about the wedding rehearsal dinner? I bought a new dress and everything. I stared at the screen, unable to find the words to explain that none of us were invited, that Sarah was apparently ashamed of our entire family. Janet had been like a second mother to Sarah growing up, babysitting her every weekend and teaching her how to braid friendship bracelets and bake chocolate chip cookies from scratch. She'd saved up her tips from the diner to buy Sarah a beautiful silver necklace for graduation, presenting it with tears of pride and joy. Now Sarah considered Janet too working class to attend her wedding reception. I typed and deleted several responses before finally writing back, "I'll call you later to explain." There was no good way to break the news that our family wasn't sophisticated enough for Sarah's new life, that 24 years of love and support had been deemed insufficient by a girl who used to fall asleep in my arms every night. The weight of this betrayal felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried, including those double shifts at the hospital. But I couldn't accept defeat, not when it came to my only child. I'd spent weeks wallowing in hurt and confusion, but now determination was replacing despair in my chest, like sunrise burning away morning fog. Sarah was making a mistake, choosing temporary social acceptance over the family who'd loved her unconditionally since birth. The Carter family might have money and connections, but they didn't have history with Sarah, didn't know that she cried during every Disney movie or that she still slept with the stuffed elephant I'd bought her for her 3rd birthday. They saw her as an asset to their social circle, but I saw her as the little girl who used to help me fold laundry while we watched old musicals together on Sunday afternoons. If I could just remind her of who we really were beneath the surface differences in income and social status, maybe I could reach the daughter I knew was still buried somewhere under Margaret Carter's influence. I picked up the music box again, winding the key slowly as I formulated a plan that would either restore our relationship or destroy it completely. The plan crystallized during my lunch break at Mercy General, sitting in my car with a peanut butter sandwich and the crumpled wedding invitation spread across my dashboard. I would attend the wedding whether Sarah wanted me there or not, armed with the music box and 24 years of memories she couldn't erase. Not to cause drama or embarrass her in front of the Carters, but to remind her that some bonds transcend social expectations and financial statements. I'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let Margaret Carter's snobbery steal my daughter away without a fight. The ceremony was being held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on Maple Street at 2 o'clock, followed by the reception at the country club where Richard Carter served on the board of directors. I knew the church layout from attending my co-worker Linda's daughter's wedding there last year, knew there were side doors and back pews where I could slip in unnoticed. All I needed was 5 minutes alone with Sarah before the ceremony began. 5 minutes to give her the music box and remind her of everything we'd shared. If she still wanted me to leave after that, I would respect her decision and disappear quietly. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I dressed carefully in my best black suit and the pearl necklace Sarah had given me 3 Christmases ago. The music box sat wrapped in silver paper on my dresser, a note tucked inside explaining its history and significance to our family. I'd spent hours writing that note, trying to capture 24 years of love in a few paragraphs without sounding desperate or manipulative. The final version simply said, "Darling Sarah, this music box has watched over 3 generations of women in our family through good times and challenges, celebrations and sorrows. It represents the love that connects us across time and circumstances, the kind of love that doesn't depend on social status or bank accounts. I pray that someday you'll pass it on to your own daughter with pride in where it came from and who carried it before her. All my love, Mom." I'd signed it with a small heart, the way I used to sign her school lunch notes when she was little. The weight of the wrapped box in my purse felt like carrying my entire relationship with Sarah in a package smaller than a paperback book. The church parking lot was already filling with expensive cars by 1:30, their polished surfaces reflecting the gray sky like mirrors. I recognized several faces from that disastrous dinner at Romano's, the Carter family circle gathering to witness David and Sarah's union. Margaret Carter stepped out of a silver Mercedes wearing a hat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, followed by a group of women who looked like they'd stepped out of a society magazine. I watched from my 10-year-old Honda Civic as they glided toward the church entrance, their designer heels clicking confidently on the wet pavement. None of them looked like they'd ever worried about paying bills or working double shifts, and I suddenly understood Sarah's desperation to fit in with this crowd. But understanding didn't make her rejection hurt any less, didn't erase the fact that she'd traded our history for their approval. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, whispered a prayer for courage, and stepped out into the drizzle with the music box clutched against my chest. Inside the church, I slipped into a back pew behind a massive floral arrangement that would hopefully conceal me from the main aisle. The sanctuary was breathtaking, decorated with white roses and baby's breath in elaborate displays that must have cost thousands of dollars. Soft organ music filled the space as guests continued arriving, their conversations a low murmur of excitement and social pleasantries. I spotted several of Sarah's college friends in the middle section, young women I'd welcomed into our home countless times during university breaks. They were laughing and taking selfies, apparently unbothered by my absence from this momentous occasion. Linda Morrison, Sarah's roommate from sophomore year, was wearing a dress I'd helped Sarah pick out during one of our shopping trips to the outlet mall. The irony wasn't lost on me that my daughter's friends were surrounding by reminders of our shared past, even as she tried to erase me from her future. I clutched the music box tighter and waited for my opportunity to speak with Sarah before the ceremony began. Time was running out to bridge this gap between us. At 1:45, I saw my chance when the bridesmaids filed into the church's side room for final preparations. Through the partially open door, I caught a glimpse of Sarah in her wedding dress, a vision in white silk and Belgian lace that took my breath away. She looked exactly like I'd always imagined she would on her wedding day. Radiant and beautiful, and grown up in a way that made my heart ache with pride and loss simultaneously. Margaret Carter was adjusting Sarah's veil while giving instructions to the wedding photographer, her voice carrying that authoritative tone I'd come to associate with disappointment and judgment. I waited until Margaret stepped away to speak with the florist before making my move, slipping out of the pew and walking quickly toward the preparation room. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone in the church could hear it, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. This might be my only chance to reconnect with my daughter before I lost her forever to a world that had no place for women like me. Sarah looked up from adjusting her bouquet as I appeared in the doorway, her face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been relief before settling into resigned disappointment. "Mom, what are you doing here? I thought I made it clear that we didn't want you to attend." Her voice was quiet but firm, mindful of the other people moving around us in the small space. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, buying us a few precious moments of privacy before Margaret Carter returned to reclaim control of the situation. Sarah looked stunning in her dress, but there was something hollow in her eyes, a sadness that expensive fabric and perfect makeup couldn't quite conceal. I pulled the wrapped music box from my purse and held it out to her with trembling hands. "I brought you something that belongs to you, something that's been waiting in our family for this day." Sarah stared at the silver package like it might explode, her bouquet forgotten in her other hand. For just a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to believe in fairy tales and happy endings. "Sarah, I know you're angry with me, and I know the Carters have made you feel like you have to choose between their world and ours," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But before you make that choice permanently, I want you to remember something your grandmother told me on my wedding day. She said that real love doesn't require you to become someone else. It celebrates who you already are." I gestured toward the music box, which Sarah still hadn't taken from my hands. "This belonged to your great-grandmother, then your grandmother, then me. Each of us danced to its song on the most important day of our lives, and each of us hoped to pass it on to a daughter who would understand its meaning. It's not valuable in dollars and cents, but it represents something more precious than money, a love that doesn't depend on social status or approval from strangers." Sarah's eyes were filling with tears now, smudging her carefully applied makeup. "I can't take that, Mom. You don't understand what's at stake here. David's family expects certain things, and I can't disappoint them on our wedding day." Her voice cracked on the last words, revealing the scared young woman hiding beneath the sophisticated bride. Before I could respond, Margaret Carter swept into the room like a force of nature, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Sarah, darling, what's wrong? You look upset, and we can't have that affecting your photographs." She noticed me standing there with the music box, and her expression hardened into polite disapproval. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm surprised to see you here. Sarah mentioned that you wouldn't be able to attend due to a prior commitment." The lie hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, and I saw Sarah flinch at her future mother-in-law's casual dismissal of our relationship. Margaret's gaze fell on the wrapped package in my hands, and her smile became even more artificial. "How thoughtful of you to bring a gift. The gift table is set up in the reception hall, though I believe Sarah and David are focusing on their registry items from Tiffany and Williams-Sonoma." She managed to make my humble offering sound like something embarrassing, a cheap trinket that would look pathetic next to their expensive wedding presents. I watched Sarah shrink under Margaret's implicit criticism, and my heart broke for both of us. But then something shifted in Sarah's expression, a flicker of the rebellious spirit I'd raised her to have. She reached out and took the music box from my hands, her fingers brushing mine in a moment of connection that felt like hope. "Actually, Margaret, this is a family heirloom that's been passed down through generations. It's not something you'd find in any store." Her voice was steady now, gaining strength with each word. Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise at Sarah's gentle correction, and I felt a surge of pride at my daughter's newfound backbone. Sarah carefully unwrapped the silver paper and opened the music box, releasing the familiar melody of "The Way You Look Tonight" into the small room. For a moment, we were all silent as the tinkling notes played, and I saw tears gathering in Sarah's eyes as memories flooded back. Margaret looked confused by the emotion this simple object was generating, clearly not understanding its significance to our family history. "It's lovely, dear, but perhaps we should save the sentimental moments for after the ceremony. The photographer is waiting, and your hair needs touching up." Margaret's tone suggested this was a minor inconvenience rather than a pivotal moment in our relationship. Sarah closed the music box, but held it firmly in her hands, no longer the passive bride being managed by her future mother-in-law. "Margaret, could you give us just a few minutes alone? I need to speak with my mother privately." The word mother carried a weight and acknowledgement that hadn't been there before, and I saw Margaret's carefully controlled expression falter slightly. "Well, I suppose a few minutes won't hurt, but we really can't delay the ceremony. The minister has another wedding at 4, and your guests are already seated." Margaret glanced at her expensive watch pointedly before sweeping out of the room, her heels clicking with authority, even in retreat. Sarah and I stood facing each other in the sudden silence, the music box between us like a bridge across months of hurt and misunderstanding. She was still my little girl beneath all that silk and sophistication, still the daughter who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and ask me to sing her to sleep. "Mom," she whispered, and in that one word I heard the child she'd been and the woman she was becoming. "I've been so scared," Sarah admitted, sinking into a nearby chair with her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. "The Carters expect so much, and David keeps talking about how important it is for me to fit in with his social circle. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, sophisticated enough, I could earn their respect and secure our future together." She looked down at the music box in her hands, her thumb tracing the faded roses painted on its lid. But every time I tried to become the person they wanted me to be, I felt like I was losing pieces of myself. The girl who used to help you with the grocery shopping, who knew every song from The Sound of Music by heart, who wasn't ashamed of our little apartment or our second-hand furniture. Fresh tears were falling now, and I wanted nothing more than to wrap her in my arms like I had when she was small, and the world seemed too big and scary. "I thought maybe if I kept you away from the wedding, I could convince them that I was born into their world, that I didn't have a past that might embarrass them." Her voice broke on the last words, and I finally understood the impossible position she'd put herself in. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, moving closer and kneeling beside her chair. "You don't have to earn love or respect from people who are worthy of you. Real family, real love, accepts you exactly as you are, including where you came from and who helped shape you." I reached out and gently touched her hand where it rested on the music box. "The Carters might have money and social connections, but what we have is something they can't buy or manufacture. We have history, we have memories, We have a bond forged through years of supporting each other through everything life could throw at us. Sarah looked up at me through her tears, and for the first time in months I saw my daughter clearly, not the polished society bride she'd been trying to become. David loves you, Sarah, but if his family can't accept where you came from, they don't deserve you. And if you have to pretend to be someone else to keep their approval, then you're not building your marriage on a solid foundation. I squeezed her hand gently, feeling the familiar warmth of connection that had been missing for so long. Whatever you decide today, know that I love you unconditionally, and that will never change, no matter how far apart we drift. The door opened again, and this time it was David who entered, handsome in his black tuxedo, but looking concerned about his bride's emotional state. "Sarah, honey, the wedding coordinator says we need to start in 5 minutes. Is everything okay?" He noticed me kneeling beside Sarah's chair, and his expression shifted to confusion mixed with what might have been annoyance. "Mrs. Thompson, I didn't expect to see you here. Sarah said you weren't able to make it to the wedding." There was an awkward pause as he tried to process the scene before him. His bride in tears, her estranged mother by her side, and tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and said quietly, "David, we need to talk before we do this. About my family, about who I really am, about the person you're actually marrying." David glanced at his watch nervously, clearly more concerned about keeping the ceremony on schedule than addressing whatever crisis was unfolding in this small room. "Can't this wait until after the reception? My parents have invited some very important people, and we can't keep them waiting." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized this was the moment when Sarah would have to choose between the life she'd been trying to build and the truth of who she really was. Sarah stood up slowly, smoothing down her wedding dress with one hand while clutching the music box with the other. She looked at David with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of love and sadness and newfound resolve that transformed her face completely. "David, do you remember the night we met at the university coffee shop? I was wearing a $10 dress from the thrift store and writing articles for the campus newspaper because I needed the job to help pay for textbooks." Her voice was steady now, gaining strength with each word. "I told you about my mom working double shifts at the hospital, about how proud I was of her for raising me alone after my father left. You said you admired my strength and independence, that you loved how real and genuine I was compared to the other girls you'd dated." David shifted uncomfortably, clearly not liking where this conversation was heading. "That's different, Sarah. We were just kids then, and now we have responsibilities to my family's reputation and business connections. My parents have worked hard to introduce you to their social circle, and they expect you to fit in appropriately." The words came out harsher than he'd probably intended, and I saw Sarah flinch as if he'd slapped her. "Fit in appropriately," Sarah repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. "What does that mean exactly, David? Does it mean pretending my mother doesn't exist because she's not wealthy enough for your parents' approval? Does it mean lying about my background and acting ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities?" She opened the music box and let the melody play, the sweet notes filling the tense silence between them. "This music box represents 4 generations of strong women in my family, women who loved deeply and worked hard and never apologized for who they were. My great-grandmother carried it through the Depression, my grandmother through World War II, my mother through single parenthood and financial struggles. Now you're asking me to hide it away because it doesn't match your mother's idea of appropriate wedding gifts." David looked confused and frustrated, clearly not understanding why a simple music box was causing such drama on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. "Sarah, you're being emotional and irrational. My family has done nothing but welcome you and try to help you succeed in social circles that could benefit both of us professionally and financially." His dismissive tone made it clear that he saw this as a minor disagreement rather than a fundamental question about their future together. The music box melody continued playing as Sarah made her decision, the familiar tune giving her courage to speak the truth that had been building inside her for months. "David, I love you, but I can't marry someone who asks me to choose between him and my family, between acceptance and authenticity." Her words came out calm and clear, each one carefully chosen and delivered with quiet dignity. If your parents can't accept my mother at our wedding reception, if they're embarrassed by where I come from and who raised me, then they're not accepting me either. They're accepting a version of me that doesn't really exist, a fantasy bride who appeared fully formed, without a history or family that shaped her. She closed the music box, but kept it pressed against her heart, drawing strength from its significance. I won't start our marriage by lying about who I am or pretending to be ashamed of the most important person in my life. If we can't build our relationship on honesty and acceptance of each other's complete selves, including our families and backgrounds, then we're building it on sand. David stared at her in shock, clearly never expecting his compliant bride-to-be to suddenly develop such strong opinions about their wedding arrangements. Sarah, you're making a huge mistake. My family's connections could open doors for both of us that you can't even imagine. Don't throw that away over sentimental attachment to the past. But Sarah was already shaking her head, her decision made with the clarity that comes from finally understanding what really matters. David, if our future success depends on me denying my past, then it's not a future I want to be part of. She looked at me with eyes that held all the love and connection that had been missing for months, and I felt tears of relief and pride streaming down my cheeks. Mom, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. I let other people's opinions make me ashamed of our life together, ashamed of the incredible woman who raised me with more grace and strength than I ever recognized. I forgot that being loved unconditionally is worth more than all the social approval in the world. She moved toward me with the music box still clutched in her hands, and when she hugged me, it felt like coming home after being lost for a very long time. I want you at my wedding, Mom. Not hidden in the back pew, but standing beside me where you belong. And if the Carters can't accept that, then maybe this isn't the right wedding to be having. David's face went through several expressions as he processed what Sarah was saying, finally settling on a mixture of anger and disbelief that his perfect society wedding was falling apart right before the ceremony. You can't be serious, David said, his voice rising slightly as panic began to set in. Sarah, there are 200 people out there waiting for us, including some of the most influential families in the state. My father's business partners, the country club board members, 3 state senators. You can't just call off our wedding because of some family drama. He gestured dismissively toward me, and I saw Sarah's expression harden at his casual disrespect. This isn't family drama, David. This is about fundamental values and whether we can build a marriage based on mutual respect and acceptance. If you think asking me to choose between you and my mother is reasonable, then we have very different ideas about love and loyalty. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the silk of her wedding dress now, a strength I recognized from her childhood when she'd refused to back down from bullies on the playground. I need to know right now. Can you look my mother in the eye and genuinely welcome her into our family? Or are you asking me to spend our marriage pretending she doesn't exist to keep your parents happy? The question hung between them like a sword, and I watched David struggle with an answer that would determine not just this moment, but the rest of their lives together. David ran his hands through his carefully styled hair, his perfect wedding day demeanor cracking under the pressure of an ultimatum he'd never seen coming. Sarah, you're putting me in an impossible position. My family has certain expectations, and they've invested a lot of money and effort in making this wedding perfect for their social circle. He glanced toward the door nervously, probably hearing the murmur of guests growing restless in the sanctuary. Can't we just get through today without causing a scene and then discuss family arrangements privately later? His attempt at compromise revealed everything Sarah needed to know about his priorities, and I watched my daughter straighten her shoulders with newfound resolve. David, getting through today would mean starting our marriage with a lie, asking my mother to pretend she's not important to me so your parents feel comfortable. She shook her head sadly, still holding the music box against her heart like a talisman. That's not the foundation I want for our life together. If you can't understand why that's wrong, then maybe we're not as compatible as I thought we were. The weight of those words settled over the small room like dust after an earthquake, and I realized that my daughter was prepared to walk away from everything she'd planned for the past year rather than compromise her integrity. David's face went pale as he finally understood that this wasn't a negotiation he could win with charm or logic. Fine, David said finally, his voice tight with frustration and wounded pride. If having your mother's approval is more important to you than our future together, then maybe you're right. Maybe we're not compatible after all. He straightened his bow tie with sharp, angry movements, transforming back into the entitled young man I'd glimpsed during that dinner at Romano's. I'll go explain to my parents and the guests that the wedding is postponed due to family complications. I'm sure they'll be fascinated by your sudden attack of conscience. His words were designed to hurt, to make Sarah reconsider by emphasizing the social embarrassment she was about to cause, but they had the opposite effect. Sarah's expression remained serene, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. David, I hope someday you find someone who's willing to hide her real self to fit into your family's expectations. But that person isn't me, and pretending it was would have made us both miserable eventually. She held out her engagement ring, a massive diamond that had never quite looked right on her finger, and placed it gently on a nearby table. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out what really matters, but I'm grateful we discovered this incompatibility before we made vows we couldn't keep. As David stormed out to face the assembled wedding guests and his furious parents, Sarah and I stood alone in the small room, surrounded by the remnants of a wedding that would never happen. The silence felt peaceful rather than tragic, like the calm after a storm has passed and cleared the air of everything that was false or forced. Sarah looked down at her elaborate wedding dress, running her fingers over the expensive Belgian lace, and laughed softly. You know what's funny? I never even liked this dress. It was everything Margaret thought I should want, but it never felt like me. She opened the music box again, letting the melody fill the space between us, and this time the song sounded like celebration rather than sorrow. Mom, will you help me out of this dress? I think I'd like to go home and put on jeans and make grilled cheese sandwiches while we figure out what comes next. The request was so perfectly Sarah, so reminiscent of countless afternoons when we changed out of church clothes and spent lazy Sundays together, that I started crying all over again. Of course, sweetheart. But first, I want to tell you how proud I am of your courage. It took tremendous strength to choose authenticity over social acceptance. Through the door, we could hear the commotion as David presumably explained the situation to the shocked wedding guests. Margaret Carter's voice rose above the others, sharp with indignation and barely controlled fury. This is absolutely unthinkable. The humiliation, the expense, the social embarrassment. Her words carried through the thin walls, but Sarah seemed remarkably unbothered by the chaos she'd unleashed in the sanctuary. Instead, she was carefully removing her cathedral-length veil, folding it with the same methodical precision she'd used as a child when putting away her favorite toys. I keep thinking about something you told me when I was 12, and Jessica Miller was being mean to me at school, Sarah said, her fingers working on the tiny pearl buttons that ran down her spine. You said that people who require you to change who you are to earn their approval aren't worth having as friends. I just never thought that principle would apply to in-laws and fiancés. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that a lesson learned in 6th grade had taken her 24 years to fully understand and apply to adult relationships. Sometimes the most important lessons take time to sink in, I replied, helping her step out of the elaborate gown that had cost more than most people's cars. Underneath, she wore simple white undergarments that looked surprisingly practical compared to the ornate dress pooling around her feet like spilled paint. Your great-grandmother used to say that you couldn't build a house on someone else's foundation and expect it to stand through storms. I think she was talking about exactly this kind of situation. Sarah nodded thoughtfully as she reached for the simple blue sundress hanging in the church's storage closet, something one of the bridesmaids had brought as a backup outfit. I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd gone through with the wedding. Would I have spent the rest of my life pretending to be someone else, gradually losing pieces of myself until I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror? She slipped the sundress over her head, transforming instantly from elaborate bride to the daughter I'd always known and loved. The scariest part is that I was willing to do exactly that, to sacrifice everything real and authentic for the security of David's family's approval and financial status. The door burst open without warning, and Margaret Carter swept in like an avenging angel, her face flushed with rage and her expensive hat slightly askew. Sarah Michelle Thompson, what is the meaning of this catastrophe? Do you have any idea what you've done to our family's reputation? Her voice shook, with barely controlled fury, as she took in the scene. Sarah, in her casual sundress, the wedding gown abandoned on the floor, and me standing protectively beside my daughter. 200 guests are sitting in that sanctuary, including some of the most prominent families in 3 counties, and you've made fools of all of us with this ridiculous display of dramatics. Margaret's gaze fell on the music box in Sarah's hands, and her expression darkened further. I should have known this was your mother's influence. She's filled your head with sentimental nonsense about family loyalty instead of helping you understand the importance of social advancement. Her words stung, but I remained silent, letting Sarah handle this confrontation in her own way. Mrs. Carter, Sarah said quietly, I'm sorry about the inconvenience and embarrassment, but I couldn't marry David under false pretenses. If your family's approval requires me to pretend my mother doesn't exist, then we're fundamentally incompatible. Margaret's laugh was harsh and bitter, full of the kind of entitled disbelief that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. Incompatible? Sarah, do you understand what you're throwing away? David is positioned to inherit one of the largest commercial real estate portfolios in the region. Our family's connections could have opened doors for you that most people only dream about. Country club memberships, charity board positions, invitations to the most exclusive social events in the state. She gestured dramatically, as if these opportunities were tangible objects Sarah was carelessly discarding. Instead, you're choosing to remain trapped in the working-class mediocrity you came from, all because your mother's feelings are hurt that she wasn't included in our social circle. Margaret's words revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about what had just transpired, her inability to comprehend that Sarah's decision was about integrity rather than social climbing. You'll regret this for the rest of your life when you're back to shopping at discount stores and worrying about paying bills instead of enjoying the lifestyle we could have provided. Her prediction hung in the air like a curse, designed to make Sarah reconsider by emphasizing everything she was supposedly giving up. But Sarah stood straighter with each of Margaret's insults, her resolve strengthening rather than weakening under the assault. Mrs. Carter, you're right that I'm giving up wealth and social status and all the material benefits that come with marrying into your family. But what you don't understand is that I'm gaining something infinitely more valuable, the ability to look at myself in the mirror without shame. Sarah's voice remained calm and respectful, despite Margaret's hostility, showing a maturity and grace that made me swell with pride. I'd rather shop at discount stores with my integrity intact than wear designer clothes while pretending to be ashamed of the woman who raised me. Some things are more important than money and social connections, and it took almost losing my mother's love to remember what those things are. She held up the music box, its painted roses catching the light from the stained glass windows. This represents 4 generations of women who chose love over convenience, authenticity over approval. I'm honored to be part of that legacy, and I won't trade it for country club memberships or charity board positions. Margaret's face went through several expressions as she processed this rejection of everything her family valued, finally settling on cold disdain mixed with genuine bewilderment that anyone would choose differently. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Margaret said finally, her voice icy with finality. Don't come crying to us when reality sets in and you realize what you've thrown away for the sake of sentimental foolishness. She turned on her expensive heels and stalked toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final blow. David deserves better than someone who would humiliate him publicly over family loyalty. We'll make sure he finds a wife who understands the importance of social advancement over emotional attachment to the past. Her words were designed to wound, to plant seeds of doubt about whether Sarah had made the right choice, but they had the opposite effect. Sarah smiled serenely, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. Mrs. Carter, I hope David does find someone who shares your values and priorities. He'll be happier with a woman who wants the same things he wants, just like I'll be happier with someone who accepts and celebrates where I come from instead of asking me to hide it. Margaret's exit was theatrical and final, the door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the stained glass windows. In the sudden silence, Sarah and I looked at each other, and simultaneously burst into laughter that was part relief, part hysteria, and part pure joy at being reunited. "Well," Sarah said when our laughter finally subsided, "I guess that's one way to end an engagement. I should probably go apologize to the wedding guests and explain that the reception is canceled." She looked toward the door where we could still hear voices raised in confusion and indignation, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "Mom, what if Margaret's right? What if I just made the biggest mistake of my life? What if no one else will ever want to marry me after this, and I end up alone and poor and full of regrets?" The questions came out in a rush, revealing the fear that lurked beneath her newfound confidence. I took her hands in mine, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness, despite her brave front. "Sweetheart, anyone who would judge you for choosing family loyalty over social climbing isn't worthy of you anyway. The right person will admire your integrity and strength, not ask you to compromise them for his convenience." I squeezed her hands gently, trying to transfer some of my certainty to her wavering resolve. "And as for being poor, we've been there before and survived just fine. Money doesn't buy happiness, but authentic relationships do. You just proved that you understand the difference." Sarah nodded slowly, her confidence returning as she absorbed my words and remembered her own reasons for making this choice. "You're right. If someone can't love me enough to accept my family, then he doesn't really love me at all. He loves the idea of me, the version of me that fits his social requirements." She straightened her shoulders and picked up the music box, cradling it like the precious family treasure it was. "I need to go face those people and own my decision, even if they think I'm crazy for choosing love over money." She paused at the door, looking back at me with eyes that held all the warmth and connection that had been missing for so many months. "Mom, will you come with me? I know it'll be awkward and probably uncomfortable, but I don't want to hide our relationship anymore. I want everyone to see that I'm proud to be your daughter, regardless of what they think about our social status." The request filled my heart with more joy than I'd felt since receiving that devastating phone call weeks ago. "Of course I'll come with you. We'll face this together, just like we faced everything else in our lives." I linked my arm through hers, and together we walked toward the door that led back to the sanctuary and whatever consequences awaited us there. The scene in the church was exactly what you'd expect after a last-minute wedding cancellation. Chaos mixed with shock, anger, and morbid curiosity. Guests were milling around in expensive clothes, some heading for the exits, while others clustered in small groups to discuss this unprecedented social disaster. David stood near the altar, looking shell-shocked and humiliated, his groomsmen hovering nearby like they weren't sure whether to comfort him or distance themselves from the drama. Richard Carter was speaking in low, urgent tones on his cell phone, probably trying to minimize the damage to his business reputation, while other members of the Carter family gathered around him in a protective circle. When Sarah and I appeared in the main aisle, conversations stopped mid-sentence as 200 pairs of eyes turned to stare at us. I felt Sarah's arm tighten against mine, but her steps never faltered as we walked toward the front of the church where a microphone waited at the podium. The whispers started immediately. "Is that her mother? I thought she wasn't invited. What kind of family drama causes someone to cancel their wedding?" The speculation followed us down the aisle like a wave, but Sarah kept her chin up and her expression serene, every inch the dignified woman I'd raised her to be. Sarah approached the microphone with the same grace she'd shown throughout this ordeal, the music box still clutched in her free hand like a talisman. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an explanation and an apology for the confusion and inconvenience of this afternoon." Her voice carried clearly through the sanctuary, steady and composed despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "David and I have realized that we have fundamental differences in our values and priorities that make marriage inadvisable at this time. I take full responsibility for this last-minute decision, and I'm deeply sorry for any embarrassment or inconvenience it may cause." The crowd stirred restlessly, clearly expecting more details about what had caused such a dramatic reversal. But Sarah's next words surprised everyone. "I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my mother, Carol Thompson, who taught me the most important lesson of my life, that authentic love doesn't require you to change who you are or hide where you came from." She turned to smile at me, And in that moment, I understood that this public acknowledgement was her way of reclaiming our relationship in front of everyone who had been asked to pretend I didn't exist. My mother raised me to value integrity over social acceptance, and today I remembered what that means. The silence in the sanctuary was complete now, every guest hanging on her words as they tried to process this unexpected turn of events. For those of you who don't know, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, my mother is a nursing assistant at Mercy General Hospital, where she spent 15 years caring for patients with compassion and dedication. She worked multiple jobs to put me through college, often going without things she needed so I could have opportunities she never had. She taught me to be kind, to work hard, to treat everyone with respect regardless of their social status or bank account. Sarah's public tribute to me was everything I'd ever wanted to hear, but never expected to receive, especially not in front of 200 strangers who had been told I wasn't important enough to include in her wedding. Today, I almost made the mistake of trading that incredible example of love and sacrifice for social connections and financial security. I'm grateful that I came to my senses before it was too late to repair the most important relationship in my life. She held up the music box, its painted roses visible even from the back pews. This music box represents 4 generations of strong women in my family who chose love over convenience, authenticity over approval. I'm proud to continue that tradition, even if it means disappointing people who expected me to choose differently. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to criticize her decision to value family loyalty over social advancement. The reaction from the assembled guests was mixed and immediate. Some faces showed understanding and even admiration for Sarah's courage, while others displayed the kind of scandalized disapproval that comes from watching someone reject everything they themselves valued. I noticed several of Sarah's college friends nodding approvingly, remembering the girl they'd known who was proud of her working-class roots and her mother's sacrifices. But the Carter family's social circle looked uniformly horrified by this public rejection of their values and lifestyle. Margaret Carter sat rigid in the front pew, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, while Richard Carter continued his urgent phone conversation, probably trying to control the narrative before it spread through their business community. David remained near the altar, his expression cycling between anger, humiliation, and what might have been grudging respect for Sarah's honesty. The whispers started again as guests began processing what they'd just witnessed. A bride publicly choosing her working-class mother over her wealthy in-laws, integrity over social climbing, authenticity over acceptance. Some would call it romantic and brave, others would call it foolish and self-destructive. But no one would forget the day Sarah Thompson chose love over money in front of 200 witnesses. As we walked back down the aisle together, I felt a mixture of pride and concern for the consequences Sarah would face for this very public stand. The social circle she was rejecting wouldn't forgive easily, and the professional connections she was severing might have lasting impacts on her career prospects. But the daughter walking beside me was the same girl who had stood up to bullies in elementary school, who had worked 2 jobs in college to help with expenses, who had never been afraid to fight for what she believed in until the Carter family convinced her that fighting wasn't sophisticated enough for their social circle. "Are you okay?" I whispered as we reached the back of the church, and Sarah nodded with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "I'm better than okay, Mom. I feel like myself again for the first time since I started trying to become someone else." We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the gray afternoon, leaving behind the chaos and confusion of a wedding that was never meant to be. "What happens now?" I asked, and Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free in the drizzling rain. "Now we go home and make those grilled cheese sandwiches I promised you. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." 3 weeks later, Sarah moved back into her childhood bedroom while she sorted out her life and figured out what came next. She'd given up the apartment she'd shared with David, along with most of the expensive furniture and gifts his family had provided during their engagement. The music box sat on her dresser where it had belonged all along, its melody playing softly each morning as she got ready for work at the local newspaper where she'd found a job covering community events and human interest stories. It wasn't glamorous or high-paying, But it was honest work that utilized her journalism degree without requiring her to compromise her values for social advancement. Margaret Carter had been true to her word about making sure the story of Sarah's humiliation of their family spread through their social circle. But the narrative that emerged wasn't quite what she'd expected. Some people criticized Sarah for her selfish decision to prioritize family over financial security, but others admired her courage to choose authenticity over social climbing. The story even made it into the society pages, where it was described as either a cautionary tale about the importance of social compatibility or an inspiring example of choosing love over money, depending on the perspective of the writer. David had reached out twice since the wedding, once to retrieve his belongings, and once to ask if she wanted to try couples counseling to work through their communication issues. Sarah declined both times politely but firmly, explaining that their problems weren't about communication, but about fundamental differences in values that couldn't be resolved through therapy. She'd heard through mutual friends that his parents were already introducing him to eligible young women from their social circle. Women who wouldn't require extensive coaching to fit into their world, or who might embarrass them with inconvenient family attachments. "It's funny," Sarah told me over our nightly cup of tea. "I thought losing David would feel like losing my future, but instead, it feels like getting my life back." She was dating a teacher she'd met while covering a school board meeting, a man who thought her mother was amazing and who insisted on bringing flowers for both of us when he came to dinner. He wants to hear stories about my childhood and our camping trips to state parks. He thinks it's incredible that you worked 3 jobs to put me through college, and he can't understand why anyone would be ashamed of that kind of sacrifice and dedication. The relief in her voice was palpable, the joy of being with someone who celebrated rather than criticized her background and family history. The music box had resumed its rightful place in our family traditions, playing its sweet melody during Sunday morning cleanings and quiet evening conversations. Sarah had asked me to keep it until she found someone worthy of sharing its history, someone who would understand its significance and add his own chapter to its story of enduring love. "I want to give it to a man who appreciates where it came from and who it represents," she explained, winding the key slowly as we sat together in our small living room. "Someone who sees it as a treasure rather than an embarrassment, who understands that real wealth comes from relationships that stand the test of time." We'd started a new tradition of opening it every Sunday after dinner, letting its melody remind us of the women who had carried it before us and the lessons they'd learned about love, sacrifice, and staying true to yourself despite external pressures. "Your great-grandmother would be proud of your choice," I told Sarah, watching her face soften with contentment as the familiar notes filled our modest apartment. She always said that the music box would find its way to women who understood its true value, who weren't swayed by the promise of easier lives if they just gave up their principles. Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the faded roses painted on its lid, and I knew that our family's legacy of choosing love over convenience would continue for another generation. Looking back 6 months later, I realized that Sarah's canceled wedding was actually the beginning of her real life rather than the end of her dreams. The courage she showed that day in the church preparation room, choosing authenticity over social acceptance, set the tone for everything that followed. She'd learned to trust her own judgment again instead of constantly seeking approval from people whose values didn't align with her own. The music box sits on her new dresser in the apartment she shares with Mark, the teacher who proposed to her last month with a simple ring he'd saved for months to buy. Their engagement announcement in the local newspaper mentioned that the bride-to-be is proud to be the daughter of Carol Thompson, a dedicated healthcare worker whose strength and sacrifice made her daughter's education and success possible. No mention of country clubs or social connections, just honest acknowledgement of the love that shaped her into the woman she became. "This time I'm planning a wedding that celebrates who we really are," Sarah told me, as we looked through simple wedding dresses at a local boutique. "No pretending, no hiding, no compromising our values for other people's approval. Just 2 people who love each other and the families that shaped them, coming together to build something real and lasting." The new wedding will be small and intimate, held in the community center where Sarah volunteers teaching literacy classes to adult learners. My sister Janet will be the maid of honor, wearing the dress she bought for the first wedding that never happened. My co-workers from the hospital are invited, along with Mark's fellow teachers and Sarah's colleagues from the newspaper. The reception will feature food from the diner where Janet works, music from a local band that plays at school fundraisers, and decorations made by hand instead of ordered from expensive florists. Most importantly, the music box will have its traditional place of honor on the gift table, ready to pass from my hands to Sarah's during the mother-daughter dance that was eliminated from her first wedding to save time for more important social rituals. "I can't wait to dance with you to that song," Sarah said when we were discussing the reception plans. "And I want everyone there to understand exactly what it means to our family." This wedding will celebrate not just Sarah and Mark's love for each other, but the generations of strong women who passed down the values that made their authentic relationship possible. The guest list may be smaller and the budget more modest, but the love will be immeasurably greater because it's built on truth instead of pretense. As I write this story, the music box plays its familiar melody from Sarah's dresser, where it will remain until her wedding day in 3 months. The painted roses have faded over the decades, but the song is as sweet as ever, a reminder that some things improve with age rather than losing their value. Sarah stops by every evening after work to help with dinner and share the details of her day, rebuilding the closeness we almost lost to other people's expectations and social pressures. Mark joins us twice a week, comfortable in our modest home, and genuinely interested in the family stories and traditions that make us who we are. He's already asked about the significance of the music box, and when I explained its history, he said he felt honored to become part of a family with such strong roots and clear values. "I can't imagine wanting to change anything about Sarah or asking her to hide the people who love her," he told me, and I knew that this time my daughter had chosen wisely. The music box will continue its journey through our family, carrying with it the lessons learned by 4 generations of women who understood that real love celebrates authenticity rather than demanding transformation. The story that began with 8 devastating words, "Your absence is the only gift we want," has transformed into something entirely different, a celebration of the love that endures when we have the courage to choose truth over convenience. Sarah's canceled wedding taught us both that some gifts come disguised as losses, that sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need. The music box that symbolized our family's commitment to authentic love became the bridge that brought us back together, reminding us that the most valuable treasures are the ones that connect us to our history and help us understand who we really are beneath all the external expectations and social pressures. If you're struggling with family relationships or feeling pressured to choose between love and social acceptance, remember that the people who truly matter will love you exactly as you are, complete with your history, your family, and the values that shaped you. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to be authentically ourselves, even when it means disappointing people who want us to be someone else.